I call this the Bridgewater epidemic. And the only reason I use the word epidemic here is because I'm focusing on the Bridgewaters. In essence, this was a pandemic because it went global. Epidemic is a term for local or national outbreaks. But since we're doing Bridgewaters, I stuck with the epidemic wording. Also, that is what the wording was used in the local newspapers. But I have had questions why I didn't call it the pandemic, and it's because we're working at the Bridgewaters. The picture that you see here is Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, I was unable to find very many pictures of local events at the time. The reason I picked this is you can see that they are on a veranda. They're on an outdoor porch outside of Walter Reed Hospital. Brockton Hospital was doing the same thing. The hospitals were overflowing, so they were bringing the patients out onto the porches because they had no place more inside to put beds. But I'll get into that, but I wanted you to appreciate the fact that this was taken in 1918. So you are looking at a gentleman that was probably very ill at the time. So with that said, most of you know that we'd already been at war. We were in the middle of World War I when this epidemic started. And what I want to do for you is show what was happening in the civilian life leading up to it. And one of the things that was going on is that Woodrow Wilson was president, and he had made it so that almost every industry in the nation was working for the government now. If you made cloth, you were making uniforms. If you had food, it was divvied up the way the government thought it should be. If you were a steel factory making trolley cars, you might find yourself making ammunition now. But civilians, because of this, flocked to the cities. And they were making things like gas masks and syringes, which normally would have been imported, but during the war, that wasn't an option anymore. And you were getting people from all over the country and they were meeting people that they normally wouldn't come in contact with. And that plays a part in this outbreak because people from one area don't have the same immunities to diseases as people from another area. Due to housing shortages, housing shortages caused the cost of living to increase. And to keep down on that, people were cramming together into apartments. And not only were they sharing beds, but you would find 6, 7, 8 bachelors sharing an apartment. And when the day crew got up to go to work, the night crew would crawl into the bed that they had just emptied. It wasn't uncommon for that to be taking place. It was also causing problems with sanitation, as you can imagine. And doctors and nurses were flocking to the military to enlist. The military recruited graduating classes. They took the best of the best of the best everywhere they could find it, leaving the civilians to kind of fend for themselves. And what we also see, which will come into play a little later, is the first nationwide use of censorship and propaganda in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was determined that if it wasn't pro-American, pro-patriotic, that it should not be said, printed, or given out in any kind of written form. Wartime efforts and national morale were placed above all other causes. There was an American League that would go around, and if you said something about the president, even if it was true, but it was negative, they could report you and you'd go to jail. And also something that was happening in civilian life is the American Red Cross grew from 107 local chapters to 3,864 local chapters nationwide. Their ranks swelled over 30 million Americans, most of whom were women. So what you see in the civilian life is we've got poor sanitation, we've got crowding, we've got mixing of people from different backgrounds, and we see the same thing kind of happening in the military. The military grew from 28,000 soldiers to several million in less than a year. Congress gave $50 million to the military, not a penny of it for medical costs. And what they did was they created military camps all over the United States. And most of them were under-equipped. Most of them had at least 50,000 troops. Most of them didn't have a single microscope, let alone someone that knew how to use it. The Army Surgeon General at the time was given no medical authority or military authority. He told them how to lay out the camps. He told them to avoid overcrowding. He told them how to lay out their sanitation, and he was promptly ignored. 50,000 was normal, but men were moving in before the buildings were even ready. They were living in tents. So 50,000 is what a lot of these camps were meant to hold when they were completed, but they weren't even completed yet. And men were wintering in tents with the coldest winter on record at the time east of the Rocky Mountains. They didn't have enough clothes, they didn't have enough heat, and they were placed into severely overcrowded circumstances. When the Army Surgeon General stepped in and he said, whoa, 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 you're not only are you setting the stage for influenza, but you're opening the door and putting out a welcome mat, the military went, we need the soldiers. And again, suburban and rural men were thrown together. So it is no surprise that in September of 1917, the military suffered a measles outbreak. And that outbreak went to March of 1918, and it killed over 5,000 men in the military alone. And of course, where you have outbreaks in military camps, you also have outbreaks in the surrounding communities. So 1918 started off in the right way, with the war effort starting and measles. And to make matters worse, you've got messengers and troops that were moving really regularly from one camp to another. You didn't pick up the phone very easily back then and get a hold of what you needed in written, you didn't want to say certain things over the phone because you had party lines. So we had a lot of messengers and troops that were making their way. And so if the outbreak started in one camp, you could darn well bet it'd be not across the country in a matter of weeks. So the flu started in Haskell County, Kansas, in January and February of 1918. It was first discovered by a doctor named Dr. Loring Miner. He was a doctor that covered several hundred square miles of towns and prairies and things out in Kansas, all by himself. He was often known to be going out and taking care of family, and he'd fall asleep in the wagon and let the horse find its way home. Sometimes he'd have to take a train to get to his patients. He'd been a doctor for quite a while, and this flu scared him. What we found was that it was usual flu symptoms, but they were really severe and they were becoming fatal. And it scared him enough that even though the flu was not required to be reported, he actually got a hold of the U.S. Department of Public Health and told them there's something wrong, something different here. Of course, they promptly ignored him, although they did print it in the first 6 months. There is a notice in the paper that they published quarterly, the Department of Health, that all it said was influenza of the severe type has been in Kansas. But it promptly, within a few weeks, came and it went.
How many patients?
It's hard to count. He didn't keep too much count, but we're talking several hundred patients over quite a large area. But what scared him was just the severity of the symptoms. March 1st, 3 men from Haskell County reported to Camp Funston, one of the military camps, 300 miles away. You'll never guess what happened 2 days later. Soldiers begin to report sick.
So it's that contagious too?
Yes. This is highly contagious. Most of the incubation period is 2 to 3 days. So when it's introduced, you see typically within 48 hours, you start seeing the outbreak. Now what had happened was the illness then disappears in Haskell County. Dr. Loring Miner thinks, whew, okay, we lost a few people, but we've made it through it, things are good, boils down. When it hits in Camp Funston, it's a mild flu. Okay, it's very mild. Doesn't really kill anybody. Few fatalities, but nothing more than the average flu. It's kind of mild. Nobody makes a big deal about it. By March 18th, it is now in Camp Forest and Greenleaf in Georgia. It's already spread to Georgia.
Now, what was the initial cause? Just a mutation?
They don't know. The theory today is that it came from birds and that it mixed with another kind of influenza and created something new that we didn't have an antibody to. There are other reports that they had been burning large amounts of manure in the area, and some guys had inhaled it and it caused it, but that's highly unlikely. As far as we can tell, it was probably bird related. But it's in Kansas, it's in Georgia. Early April, our good old American troops took it to France. We loaded it up on a boat and we sent it overseas with our troops. By April 10th, the French army is reporting sickness. By late April, it's in France, England, and Italy. By May, Spain is falling ill. Now here's something to remember. Maine is a neutral country during the war. So they have no censorship of their newspapers. So they start printing about the outbreak. That's where the name Spanish flu comes along, is because people thought Spain was the first one to say anything. It must have been them that started this. But the truth is that they were the first neutral country that it really attacked. In late May, it's in Bombay, Calcutta, Rangoon, all in India. June, it's in Portugal, Greece, and Germany. July, Denmark and Norway. By August, it's in Holland, Sweden, Egypt, and China. It's around the globe. Everybody's got it. But they're calling it the 3-day illness. It's making guys sick for 3 days, and they're getting better. Over 3,000 men in the British military came down with it. 4 died. It's no big deal. It's just the flu. But then in September 1918, Wave 2 began in several places worldwide. Wave 2, it turned deadly. Now, what they think, and what was happening throughout this, what they think is that as a virus jumps from one host to the next, to the next, to the next, it mutates, okay? And it changes. And what happens is it started out hot. Think of a fire that you've just started with a little bit of kindling. You light the kindling and it flares up hot, right? But then you throw a bunch of firewood on it, and for a little while you think it's almost died out. But in little pockets around the globe, little bubbles, they're like bubbles in a boiling pot. The first few bubbles were coming to the surface. And those bubbles were nasty. The flu was aggressive, it was fatal, it was mean. But by September 1918, all that firewood we'd thrown on that kindling was starting to blaze. The flu had adapted to man, and it wasn't happy. Wave 2 began in the United States in Camp Devens, which is 35 miles northwest of Boston in Ayer, Massachusetts. It started there with a vengeance. First of all, the camp was built to hold 36,000 troops with 1,200 beds in the hospital. At the time of the outbreak, it had 50,000 men there, 14,000 more than it was built for. In one day, they had over 1,500 men report sick in one day. They were losing men, 100 men a day. They were stacking the bodies like cordwood because they couldn't find caskets. But this was such a brand new situation that nobody was prepared for it because it was just the flu. Yes?
What city was that?
Ayer, A-Y-E-R. Oh. Camp Devens is what they... Oh. It was nasty. They lost hundreds and hundreds of soldiers out of that. And we're talking, at one point, they had several thousand sick at a time, and like 3,000 or 4,000 sick. There's no actual numbers, but the hospital was built to hold 1,200. And the nurses and the doctors started dropping. So of course it started to make national news. So what are the symptoms of this, you wonder? I'm glad you asked. The symptoms, pretty easy. Headaches, body aches, fever, inflammation of the nose, throat, conjunctiva, which is the soft tissues around the eyes, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, severe exhaustion, and cough. Now, how many in the room have had most of these symptoms or all of them at one point, all at once in your lifetime? Yep. All of you, right, have all suffered from this. Pretty normal symptoms, really. And this is an actual sign that was put up during 1918. And I thought it was interesting. Yeah, don't spit. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Most of the people that fell ill with Spanish influenza had these symptoms. Most of them. 10 to 20% of the people that got sick got severe symptoms. Now, to put that in perspective for you, in the United States, that was between 2 and 3 million people that came down with these severe symptoms. The severe symptoms included terrific pain, so bad that if they were touched, they would scream. Extreme fever, so above 101. Chills, shuddering so bad that equipment would fall off the hospital beds. Vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme abdominal tenderness. Pockets of air under the skin that was caused by air escaping ruptured lungs. It would cause them to make a crackling sound when they were touched. One of the nurses at Camp Devens said that she tried to move a patient and he sounded like a bowl of Rice Krispies. And for the rest of her life, she couldn't even be in the same room with a bowl of Rice Krispies. Extreme earaches. If they didn't go in with a syringe and drain the fluid, the eardrums would rupture. Extreme headaches behind the eyes. A lot of them claimed that they felt that somebody was taking an axe to the inside of their head and trying to bust out. Severe pain behind the eyes, causing it unbearable to move their eyes, and sometimes they'd lose their vision. Most of the time that was temporary, but there were a few cases where it was permanent. Acute or fatal renal failure, their kidneys would give out. Liver damage, usually permanent. Blood would come from all orifices, including eyes, ears, spraying from the nose and frothing from the mouth, as well as the vagina and the rectum. It caused all the soft tissues of the body to hemorrhage. In some cases, blood would spray several feet from their nose. If they moved their head at all, it would drain from their ears and their eyes. Inflammation of the heart and the sac around it, the pericardium. The muscles along their rib cage would be torn apart by both internal toxic processes and just the act of coughing because they couldn't breathe well enough. Ravaged, fluid-filled lungs. Autopsies, several autopsies around the globe said that when they did autopsies, it looked like these people had breathed in poison gas. It ruined the lungs. They were flooded. Normally when you take lungs out of a body, they collapse like a balloon, and these were coming out solid. They were just a solid mass. Cyanosis was one of the symptoms. It started out with bluing across the cheeks, sometimes as deep as an indigo blue. And it would spread to the lips, ears, nose, cheeks, tongues, conjunctiva, fingers, and sometimes the whole body. They started referring to this as the Black Plague all over again. They said that the bluing was so bad that in some instances they couldn't tell African American soldiers from Caucasians. They were all the same color. They also knew with this cyanosis, the doctor said that if you came in with that symptom, if your lips and face had started to turn blue, they knew right away you were a goner. There was nothing they could do for you. Delirium, psychosis, and lasting mental problems. When they did autopsies, they found brain problems, brain tears from the swelling inside the brain. Some of these people would try to commit suicide later. Some of these mental problems would last for years after they recovered. But what does this all come down to? All of this. A severe immunity response is what it is. Your body attacked yourself to kill this virus. And it caused a response so extreme with your immune system that the body would kill itself. It wasn't the virus. It was the reaction to the virus. They actually say, and I read one of the books I read, which is up here, it's a fantastic book. He actually says if you think about a small village with its own army, and you have a bunch of invaders coming in, he said, and the army is your immune system, the invaders are the virus. He said it's the equivalent of nuking the village to save it from the invaders. That's what our immune systems were doing to ourselves. It was huge. 2 to 3 million people suffered from this in the United States. But how does a global pandemic start? What are the first signs of it? They were the same exact signs we saw locally as they saw in Kansas. T.S. Eliot tells us the world will not end with a bang, but with a, does anybody know? With a whimper, thank you. A global pandemic starts with a whimper. It starts just like this. You don't see headlines in the paper. You see these little things in the social column. And these are all out of the the Bridgewater Independent. These are all local. This is what you see. You don't see the headlines. You hear, oh, so-and-so's sick. Oh, so sad. So-and-so else is sick. Somebody else. But before you know it, everybody's sick. The first death, the official death in Brockton, took place on September 14th, 1918. It was a gentleman who had caught the flu at the Holbrook factory of the Sears and Roebuck Company. And actually, this factory ended up having to be shut down temporarily and fumigated because it caused a huge outbreak. The same news article that this is from, it says that the malady is already prevalent in Brockton. It was already spread. We already had a couple hundred cases of it reported by September 14th. Now, I call this the first official death because 3 days earlier on September 11th, we see the death of a young woman. She's 34 years old and she dies after a short illness. So I actually think she may have been an earlier death rather than the gentleman here that died first. But either way, the first death reported in Bridgewater is September 20th. It's a young woman, aged 19. Her name is Pearl Stalker. The first child fatality in Brockton was reported on September 21st. There would be quite a few children. And the reason we don't know some of the other towns and some of the other fatalities is because the flu was not a big deal. You didn't report the flu to the CDC. It wasn't a big deal. You reported measles, you reported typhoid, you reported diphtheria, but not the flu. And so people weren't tracking this because the flu happened every year. It was no big deal. But what you see first is doctors are needed. This says so many doctors have left the city to enter the war service that the burden is especially heavy on those who have remained. The Brockton Hospital has been obliged to turn patients away because of a room. This is September 21st. This is a week after the first death. They're already packed at the Brockton Hospital. September 23rd, conditions at Brockton Hospital are serious. Dr. Packard is stricken with the disease and forced to take to his bed. The house doctor is also ill. One or more of the staff of doctors is only able to bear up through sheer grit. The staff of nurses is so seriously decimated that 20 of them are now unfit for duty. It was found necessary to issue notice that no more patients would be admitted to the Brockton Hospital. September 23rd, we're just getting started. Dr. Belmore becomes stricken. Now, the reason I pulled this up is this is kind of interesting. He is stricken, he's home ill, and what's his poor wife got to deal with? He had 123 calls at his house yesterday for his professional services. The poor man can't even get any rest. So Brockton writes to other cities and says, we need help. We're in desperate need of help. And the other cities come back. Fall River comes back, New Bedford comes back, and they all say, we've got our own problems. You're on your own. Yes?
As a practical matter, what could doctors of the hospitals do for these patients?
Good question. Not much. Not much. There wasn't the medical science to help in a lot of cases. And I'm actually going to come back to that. So Brockton got so desperate that they wrote to the Army and said, give us back our doctors that have enlisted. They're desperate. This is September 25th. It's only 11 days after our outbreak. Now let me tell you, I told you earlier, the military took the cream of the crop, okay? Nationwide, there were only 100,000 doctors left in the civilian world. Most of those were only left because the military felt that they were either unfit for service or they were incompetent. So it's no surprise that we have shortage. And it's no surprise that the doctors we have can't keep up. It wasn't until October 9th. Now keep in mind, we requested doctors September 25th. We didn't get them till October 9th. That was when we told them we would get them. They didn't arrive for a few more days. By this point, the epidemic has reached its zenith. We needed those doctors 2 weeks ago. But what's great in the paper, which I didn't see anywhere else, was we had a colored doctor. Dr. P.W. Mins was seeing patients in Brockton, and I thought this was unusual. You don't normally see this, especially for the time, because segregation. But it tells you, because segregation was such an issue in 1918, that people were desperate if they were allowing a colored doctor to treat them. And I'm sure he did a fantastic job, but that was what we had in Brockton. Now, over time, we did get some doctors that visited from other towns until it was too desperate in their own towns and they had to go back. We did get some doctors that the military sent, but most of our doctors in Brockton were in the military and they weren't allowed to leave to come home to treat their own patients. Now, if doctors were a problem, nurses were even more so. A Red Cross worker wrote, "Work has never been so difficult as it is now, and it's overwhelming us. We're searching from one end of the United States to the other to rout out every possible nurse from her hiding place. There will be no more nurses left in civil life if we keep this up at this rate." This was 3 days before Camp Devens. We hadn't even started our outbreak, and we had no nurses. It was so desperate, the military was so desperate for nurses, that in one situation, a woman went to the movie theater. They stopped the show, turned off the lights, went up on stage and said, "Will Josie Williams please go see the front desk?" So Josie Williams went up to the front desk, and it was a telegram saying, "Report to the Army immediately." If you were a woman and you had any military training, the Army would find you and they would draft you. So nurses were more important than doctors, because you were talking about what doctors could do, and they couldn't do a whole lot. Nurses were more important because nurses were what really was fighting this epidemic. There was no serums, no vaccines, no antibodies. There was no real medical treatment. It was the nurses that were so vital to survival, because it was the nurses that were feeding you, were cleaning you, were keeping you hydrated, keeping you alive. And they couldn't find nurses. Ads, there were quite a few ads in the paper. This is only one. This is an actual headline. The great need is nurses, trained nurses. It was so bad that Canada sent us down some nurses on October 9th. We couldn't get them anywhere else. October 12th, out of the 30 nurses on staff at the Brockton Hospital alone, 21 of them are ill. Once we got the nurses, we couldn't keep them healthy. And the problem was, even if you do get the nurses, now how do you get them from door to door to door to door to door? So now we're looking for cars to transport them. We were begging people, give us your cars, loan us your cars. Let's get these nurses out to the houses, we need cars. Then we'd get the cars and it was, oh, now we need chauffeurs. We need somebody to drive them. These are out-of-state people coming in to help, and they don't know their way around. We need chauffeurs, and I can't tell you how many, in just the Brockton Enterprise, how many times I saw people, articles begging for nurses, for cars, and for chauffeurs. And was it a time to be a nurse? Can you guys see what this says right here?
If I fail, he dies.
No stress there, right? This is an actual picture taken during the epidemic. And you want to talk about stress. But the problem is, I mean, there wasn't even much the nurses could do other than keep you hydrated and fed. And what's Uncle Sam telling us to do? This is an actual headline, Uncle Sam's advice on the flu. This is from the Bridgewater Independent. This picture was run with the article. It says, coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells. Unfortunately, in this situation, they're probably right. But what is the number one piece of advice that's being run in every newspaper across the country? Don't panic! It's fine! Fear spreads the disease. That's the number one piece of advice that was printed in every piece of paper. Don't panic. It spreads if you panic. Then they would say, have a proper proportion of work, play, and rest. Don't overdo anything. Keep your body well clothed, but don't wear tight clothes or shoes. because then you cut off, circulation and it can make you ill. Eat sufficient, wholesome, and properly selected food. Milk is best for adults. Keep your bowels open. Always a good idea. In fact, in quite a few instances, I found adverts for laxatives to prevent Spanish influenza. Avoid overcrowding. Now that's probably the first piece of really good advice on the list. Avoid overcrowding. Fresh air is important. Take strolls. Open your bedroom windows. Walk to work.
Well, that actually would be good because you'd avoid other people.
Yeah, but who wants to go to work when your family's sick? Keep away from crowds. Again, I didn't realize I duplicated that, sorry. Do not inhale air breathed out by others. Well, that is pretty good advice. Wear masks. They're 99% effective. Now, here's the problem. The Women's American Red Cross was pumping out masks as fast as they could sew them, but they were made of gauze. In reality, we know today that they probably did nothing to stop the spread of the disease because the virus just went right through them. If sick, go immediately to bed and stay for several days after recovery. This is actually better advice than you would think. What they were finding is people that were feeling better were getting up and getting out of bed, but this virus stripped the lining of the lungs, and it left them very susceptible to secondary infections. So staying in bed for a few days after they were feeling better was actually pretty good advice. Isolate the sick, burn their handkerchiefs. That's not bad advice either. But all in all, what do we not see here? Can anybody tell me what you don't see there? Wash your hands. Ain't on the list. Germ theory was relatively new to the United States. But we were educating. Another piece of advice that we were given to our adults, to our children, to the war front, to everybody else was gargle. Salt water's best. There are pictures of World War I just like this with soldiers with their cups and their canteens out gargling. I don't know if that would be any benefit whatsoever, but that's the type of thing that we were teaching. And you can't blame them because the education level just wasn't there. I mean, the knowledge that we have today. So the first line of defense today would be closing schools. If we knew that there was an epidemic, we would think about closing schools. All Brockton told it is that children with colds should remain at home, okay? No general order to close schools has been ensued. Teachers can use their discretion to send home children. This is September 16th, 2 days after the first death. September 18th, they say, children not in school will play together freely under conditions less sanitary than those in the schoolroom. The town of Bridgewater agrees with them. They're probably to some degree, right? But Brockton on September 19th says children who show symptoms of influenza promptly are sent to their homes. This is about as far as the school board will go. It is no good to close the schools. They also said pupils have not been victims of disease. The kids aren't getting sick. So we're going to keep them in school where we can keep an eye on them because they're not getting sick. September 20th, Bridgewater and West Bridgewater say, we're going to close the schools. We're going to be safe. Because the teachers are too sick to teach. Wasn't the kids getting sick. The adults were. Finally, September 23rd, Brockton says again, but if the schools were closed, the children would play and there would be no means of tracking the illness. They might be right, I don't know. But what you see next? Wow, schools close in Brockton. Why? Almost 3,000 children are out absent. We have that many sick. And the teachers are failing. September 25th, East Bridgewater becomes the last one to close the schools. And on October 3rd, now that Brockton has finally taken the time to close the schools, on October 3rd, they're already saying, don't expect them open before the 14th. Because they've realized that there was a huge problem. But to vindicate themselves, the big headline in the paper was, we told you that they would, they'd get in trouble if they were left home. So, and to a degree, both sides in this were right. If they were in school, they probably were getting better care because their parents were sick at home. But the children were bringing it home. I didn't find out till a few years ago. My great-great-grandparents died within a few hours of each other in the epidemic. My great-grandmother was one of 4 children, orphaned. She was 12 years old. She was the oldest of the 4. She died at the age of 102 just a few years ago, and I didn't realize that she lived her entire life with the guilt because she felt she'd brought the flu home from school and killed her parents. So I'm sure that having the schools open really didn't help.
Was she asymptomatic?
Yeah, she got through it just fine.
She did not get the flu?
No, she did not.
So she did not even know she's bringing it home?
No clue. And the sad truth is, if she hadn't brought it home, somebody else would have. So even though the children aren't getting sick, though, they're mixing, they're mingling, they're sharing their coughs and their germs, and they're going home to their parents. So the next thing that happens is the town decides that all public gatherings need to be addressed. Bridgewater closes Sunday schools. Pretty early on, they close the Sunday schools. And they bar the children from theaters. Theaters are still open, they just won't admit children. Brockton orders closures of all club and lodge rooms, dance halls, theaters, the public library, and the courts. Pretty early on. I think they're kind of starting to learn their lesson from the schools. Soda fountains some of them are voluntarily closing. They're not being ordered by the health department, but some of them are doing it simply because they realize that the spread's going on. Some of them are probably like, if everybody's sick, I'm gonna take my business and go on home. The state would later close them, request that they were closed, but it would only be for a day or 2, and the state would then say, it's okay for the soda fountains to be open, but they have to be using paper cups. So they did allow them to be open. And then they were only allowed to be open so late in the evening, but they had to use disposable cups. On September 28th, they ordered bowling alleys and pool halls to close. October 1st, churches are asked to suspend their services. Although attendance had already been slim. The problem with asking churches to suspend their services is that this is a time where people are needing spiritual help. They're seeing their loved ones begin to die. They're seeing themselves get sick. They need the praying. They need the guidance. So it's kind of hard for the churches to close. What you do see is a lot of pastors start going to their congregations' homes rather than bringing the congregations in. However, there is one pastor who went on the record saying, there's less danger of the spread of disease in church than in factories of the city or at the theater. In other words, us, we're Christians. We're pretty immune. But that wasn't the normal consensus. Churches and theaters would not open in any of the towns again until October 15th. So we're talking weeks, sometimes later. They didn't mess around with it. Once they closed it, they didn't want to open them up too hastily. The problem was, by then the damage was done. One of the things they canceled, the Brockton Fair, was the 45th year it had run, the first time it had ever been canceled. Now this is a big deal because the fair was supposed to run October 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Exhibitors had already set up the exhibition hall. Exhibits had already been dropped off. There had already been 20 horses that were supposed to run in the races were already in the stables. They'd already spent all the advertising money. They've already had staff in there, and they've paid the wages for people to set everything up. And now it's canceled, and there's no way to recoup the money. In fact, they have to refund now all the tickets that have been purchased and everybody that has paid entrance fees for the horses and the other exhibits. So it was huge to the city for them to cancel the fair, and it was huge for the whole country. This is a paper from Anaconda, Montana, talking about the Brockton Fair being closed. I found articles in Iowa, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, all over the country. They were talking about the closure of the Brockton Fair. It was a huge deal. And in the meantime, it's not just these public gatherings in the schools that are being affected. Illnesses are increasing all over Bridgewater, and it's affecting businesses. This newspaper is from Davenport, Iowa. and they know about the shoe problem in our shoe factories. Davenport, Iowa, and that was printed on the 15th, the day after the first death. So pretty early on, it was noticed that the shoe industry was having problems. In this one, it says the Stanley Iron Works has a large number of employees out. It also says the post office is having a hard time getting out mail. They're asking for, the postmaster is doing the rural route by himself, and they have a civilian taking care of the parcel post. Again, this is a week after the first death. A number of departments in different factories have hardly enough employees to continue operations, it is stated, and in some cases rooms have been closed. Unless there is a marked change soon, indications that the shoe manufacturing will be badly handicapped, and some departments may have to close in order for other departments to catch up. They really contemplated, I mean, the shoe industry in Brockton was huge. That was the bread and butter for thousands and thousands of families. And they're thinking about shutting it down because at one point they had over 1,500 men out sick. The telephone operators are sick, so the telephones aren't working. The banks are having a hard time. The streetcars aren't running because the conductors are all sick. It was nationwide, but it was really riveting to see all of this taking place just in the Brockton and the Bridgewaters. Life was coming to a halt. And what was happening, and this happened in so many even large cities across the country, nobody was going outside. They were afraid. They were staying in because either they were too sick to go out already or they were afraid of becoming sick. Churches were closed, business were closed, work was closed, transportation to get to work. The phone wasn't working. People just said, I'm staying home. And the people that were out on the streets said it was like a ghost town. And it probably was. So how are we coping with the ill? The first thing we do is we set up Dr. Moore at 167 Newbury Street in Brockton, opens his private hospital to epidemic patients. Now his hospital only had 20 beds, and normally they were for surgical and obstetric patients. But even he realized that Brockton Hospital was overflowing. The new Goddard Hospital was supposed to be opened the first week of October. They were supposed to have this huge grand opening ceremony. They canceled the ceremony. They even canceled the inspection of the hospital to start moving patients in immediately. That was September 26th, so that is 11 days after the first death. The Brockton YWCA starts taking in women and children that are ill. They also start taking in some of the nurses from out of state that have no place to stay. And the old Goddard Hospital that was just vacated, they promptly cleaned it up and got it ready now to be used as an epidemic hospital. The problem was, opening was a problem. Nurses could not be found. Help for the kitchen and to get things ready seemed out of the question. They finally found cooks for volunteers and finally got ready, but they even had problems finding bed and bedding because they were cramming everybody into Brockton Hospital and everything that could be gathered had already been gathered. So, I saw in the paper that the Knights of Columbus offered their gathering hall as an emergency facility, but we couldn't get anybody to staff it, so we couldn't take them up on the offer. 2 floors of the brand new Brockton Hospital Annex, which also was not officially opened yet, was open to ill nurses. So that's where the nurses went when they were sick. Emergency hospitals were also set up at the State Farm in Bridgewater, at the Brockton Fairgrounds, at Belmont Hospital, which we found out today was on White Street by the Brockton Library. And that was, Belmont Hospital was another small private hospital with like 35 beds. And at several tenement houses, including one owned by the Stanley Iron Works in Bridgewater. The State Farm, that's a prison/insane asylum at the time, so it's pretty, you know you were bad off if you were willing to go be a patient there. And how are we dealing with it in our life? How do you like that headline? 5,000 sick in the city of Brockton. Then we start fumigating the schools, the factories, the railroad trolleys. All it said in the newspapers was strong germicidal agents. Lysol was invented, so they may have been using something very similar to Lysol. We started imposing a fine of at least $5 for spitting on sidewalks, factories, and other public places. A notice was put in the paper to put police on watch that they were to arrest for it, and signs like this appeared on streetcars and things across the country. 100 cases of illness at the State Farm. Common drinking cups are banned. You wouldn't think of it, but a lot of the factories, the shoe factories, would have a water trough and they'd have a cup that everybody would share. So those were promptly thrown away, which was probably a good thing. September 24th, the hospitals were marked as overflowing. On September 28th, we're now up to 8,000 sick and over 100 dead in Brockton alone. Now, I want you to think about, though, let's say you're sick and you're really sick, 24 hours a day you're sick. It takes at least 2 people to care for you if they want to get any sleep and they want to eat and take any breaks. So the fact that you have 8,000 sick, that's taking every resource you've got. Every family member's involved. Everybody has got somebody affected by this. On September 30th, it was written in the paper that the supply of hot broths, gruels, etc. to the sick has become big work. The Domestic Science Department, in other words, home ec, at the high school, the James Edgar Restaurant, Cook, and the Bristol Cafe have organized to help out with vital work. Yes?
What was the population of Brockton?
About 64,000. About 64. Bridgewater was about 8,000. East Bridgewater was roughly 3,000. And West Bridgewater was roughly 2,500.
So Brockton had the equivalent of the city of Bridgewater, of the town of Bridgewater, so.
Yes. Yes, good analogy. You're absolutely right. But what they're finding is people are too sick to feed themselves. And even if they're not, they're too sick to feed their kids. And they're afraid to go out. They're not going out and they're not getting groceries. Back then, you really didn't have refrigerators. Your perishables are sitting on the counter going bad. And it's becoming a huge issue. Bed clothing is another huge issue. As the nurses are going to these houses and they're finding these people that need food, they're also finding that they've been laying in their own filth in the bed for days because they couldn't get up to go to the bathroom. In a lot of instances, especially in Brockton, all of the family members are in one bed. And there's no more clean pajamas, there's no clean bed linen. Because you couldn't just throw it in the washing machine, push a button, and walk away back then. So the laundry was a huge, huge issue. The city physician, Dr. I think this is Ducey, I'm not sure if it's Ducky or Ducey, opens his home as an improvised maternity ward because babies wait on nobody. We're in the middle of the epidemic and we got to worry about babies being born. The newsboys start wearing masks, and they say that it's such a pain in the butt to take them off in between houses that they're wearing them constantly, and it's said in the paper that it looks like the war front, that they're going around with gas masks on. Letter carriers, obviously, will start doing the same thing. But letter carriers in Brockton were asked to go door to door and perform a census to count the sick and to distribute flyers of how to care for the illness. Now, this particular picture was taken of a Seattle doctor. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything in Brockton, but you can bet that anybody that went outside in Brockton was wearing a mask like this. Chauffeurs, the few that they could find, were working 16 to 18-hour days. The mayor of Brockton was one of those chauffeurs. A day nursery was established. A day nursery because they were going into these houses and they were finding mom and dad were so sick and the children were on the floor crying or starving. So they opened a day nursery, and I couldn't find out exactly where, it just said in Brockton. But they're taking the children that are well there for care. As of October 4th, we've got 400 sick in Bridgewater. So the Bridgewater is starting to get really sick. Actually, the epidemic in Bridgewater started after Brockton. So Brockton peaks, and as hard as they start coming down, Bridgewater peaks. October 5th, estimated 9,000 sick with over 185 deaths in Brockton. And most of them will never see either a doctor or a nurse. They just couldn't. If you couldn't get to the hospital, they couldn't see you. There was just no way. Lists of deaths were so long that the obituaries were 2 sentences. Shellie Karol-Chik, age 40, of Bridgewater, died yesterday. Next. That was it. That was your obituary. And they were columns in papers this tall. Column after column of obituaries. Some of them on the front page, they would just list deaths in the first 24 hours because they knew that's the only thing anybody was interested in reading. Firefighters and the police force have so many ill that they're struggling to keep up. And what can you do if you can't get to the nurse and the nurse can't get to you? How do you treat this? Don't worry, olive tar will take care of you. Pick it up at your local grocer today. This is an actual advertisement from the Bridgewater Independent. This one's from the Bridgewater Independent too. Look out for Spanish influenza. At the first sign, take quinine and bromine. Clear you up right away. And not really a home remedy, but one of the things that we found in the Brockton Enterprise I thought was interesting. Spanish influenza is not dangerous, but pneumonia is. Get your portable room heater today from the Brockton Gas Light Company. Keep warm. Now, if none of those, if you're not into the pharmaceuticals, this was from the Brockton Enterprise. It says, this is a woman suggesting a home remedy. It says, chopped onions and cornmeal mixed with vinegar to make a poultice applied after heating it as much as the patient can bear. It will clear out the lungs satisfactorily. Sounds yummy, doesn't it? You don't know whether you eat it or wear it. But if that's not to your liking, this says Camp Devens received, the beginning of this article says Camp Devens has received every type of home remedy from rum to rhubarb. This particular one says take a half a teaspoon of kerosene on a little sugar as often as you think necessary. It'll lubricate your organs and break up a cold. Is everybody here going to rush out for their bottle of kerosene on the way home? Sounds yummy, right?
It doesn't.
Well, if you want to take your chances in the pharmaceuticals, good luck. The druggists are in short supply. They're running out of everything. Germicides, disinfectants, spraying solutions. They're exhausted. You can't even find camphor. They don't have anything. Later articles will actually say that there was a problem in Brockton with some of the druggists were charging 2 and 3 times more than shelf value for the items that they had left. There's also several articles that we were sending trucks to Brockton or to Boston to pick up any kind of medical supplies we could get our hands on. So if you're at home, you have quite a variety of home treatments. Some people wore camphor balls in a bag around their neck. Some of them wore garlic around their neck. Some of them, one of the things that we saw were full-page ads for Vicks VapoRub. Vicks VapoRub's value, they went from selling $900,000 a year in product to $1.8 million.
Wow.
They doubled their sales, more than doubled. But if that doesn't work, keep your chin up, because the German army has it worse. Nothing better than good old-fashioned optimism, right? This actually was from the Brockton Enterprise, so pretty interesting. Don't worry about it. The Germans got it worse. You'll live through it. Later, on October 5th, the State Guard comes in and sets up a tent hospital on the Brockton, just east of the Brockton Hospital. And you can't see it, but there are some quarters over here for nurses, and over on this side, there are tents for the State Guard to stay in. These are all patients. 2 tents, there's 98 tents here, two people a tent. So 196 people, they call it in the papers, they say it's a 200 beds. Put up by the Massachusetts State Guard. The State Guard actually stays. They make them stay and work as orderlies and to run the ambulances. It contained 200 beds, and it replaced the old Goddard Hospital and the YWCA that had been opened. Because those 2 locations were too far apart in the city, and it was really straining the doctors and the nurses trying to get back and forth. So by centralizing everything, they were taking better care of people. It handled the most serious cases from Brockton, Bridgewater, and Whitman.
In East Bridgewater.
And East Bridgewater, yes, thank you.
Question?
Yes.
On that tent city, Brockton owned the city farm, which is just south of the Brockton Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Could that have been there rather than?
No, the newspaper clearly says that it was set up in a field just east of the Brockton Hospital. I got the impression that it was adjacent, and it was probably done so that they could pool resources and things and have the doctors and the nurses as centralized as possible. And the date on this picture is actually October 8th. And standing out front, you have the head of the Department of Health, as well as some members of the State Guard. And this picture was printed on the front page of the Brockton Enterprise.
How do they keep them warm? I mean, it's October.
Fresh air does you good. Didn't I cover that earlier? Fresh air, the fresh air. Blankets were the main thing used, but a lot of times there's pictures of a similar tent city set up in Lawrence, and they actually have the patients out on these planks. They set the cots up out on the planks. And that is advice that I see a lot through the paper is fresh air, fresh air, fresh air, fresh air. In fact, Norma and I found a picture that they were on the roof of the YWCA in Brockton. They had them on cots up there because the fresh air was supposed to do them good. That was the biggest advice they were giving people, is get fresh air. So, but blankets would have been it.
Wow.
But then again, if you're running a fever, and you close the flaps on these tents, and they're canvas. Yeah, well, yes, true. But they're heavy, heavy canvas tents. So if you're running a fever in there, you're probably heating up the inside of it pretty well with just your body heat. They brought 3 military ambulances with them, which were much, much needed. And they opened a baby tent on October 10th. They were finding too many sick babies. The infants were getting sick. So they had to open up, and the baby tent was actually heated. It does say that in the newspaper. I found, there is a picture that was posted on Facebook, but I couldn't prove it was Brockton, but it is one of these tents, and it's a larger tent, and it has several of those old metal cribs in it that look more like prison bars than baby cribs. But they did have to start taking in the infants because they didn't have any place else to put them. They did start marking the emergency vehicles with a green cross because they were having problems with traffic in the town, and they wanted to make sure that the military vehicles or the medical vehicles had the right of way, so they were given green crosses to put on them. But no matter how bad life gets, love always finds a way. Always. Even if you have to postpone it. There were quite a few articles in the newspaper. This one says the marriage of Miss Margaret Barnes Bresnahan and John Corcoran postponed indefinitely. And I would think so, because she died on her wedding day. What makes it worse is that the day of her funeral, her fiance was too sick to be at her funeral himself. This was, I can't tell you how many headlines we found like this. So many headlines. He actually lived, I actually went on the 1920 census and looked him up. I was curious, but he actually did live. Brockton girl and her fiance die at camp. It says here, I think she went there to nurse him at Camp Upton, Long Island, New York. She went there to nurse him. When she arrived, she was stricken, and within 48 hours, both were dead. She got married 3 weeks ago. Married when the death was near. They married at the camp on his deathbed. He died 30 minutes later. Can't stop love, just like you can't stop those babies. But it was definitely not a good time for it. And the families were being torn apart. The hardest hit ages for this epidemic were between 20 and 40. This line here is the, this one here, is the 1892 epidemic that went nationwide. And this is actually indicative of a normal influenza graph. You have high infant mortality in children and very high senior. In fact, pneumonia, which is the secondary, which is the killer here, pneumonia is sometimes called the old man's friend, because a lot of times that's what old men die of, women too. But in 1918, this is the graph. Look at the seniors are almost half. But our biggest hit age group was 20 to 40. Our parents, our employees, our workers were sick. They were very, very sick. And what happened was it hit them the hardest. And why did it hit them the hardest? Because that immune response I was talking about earlier, they had the strongest immune systems. So it attacked their bodies the strongest. So they didn't live through it. Children lost one or both parents. They were usually of childbearing age. I can't tell you how many of these articles we found. 6 are motherless, 7 are motherless, 3 are left as orphans. There was tons of them just from the Brockton enterprise. The group of people most likely to die, pregnant women. In the cities across the nation, the cities recorded death rates between 23 and 71%, depending on the area. Being pregnant during this was 50-50 chance you'd make it. And if you made it, if you got pregnant and you got sick and you lived through it, 26% chance to lose the baby. Talk about heartbreak. This one is a woman who just died. She'd had her baby Sunday. She was 32 years old. Left a brand new infant. Her son was born Sunday. She was a native of New Brunswick. Besides her husband and infant son, she had 3 sisters. It was that group, and it left the country devastated. Your workforce was gone. What you were left with were elderly and infants. It really, really just destroyed the country. Parents, of course, lost their children. This particular story, the lad was 7 years old. Of the whole family, there now remains but 2 members, one ill at the hospital and one at the home. Both parents are already dead. 3 of his siblings already dead. This is not uncommon during 1918, especially in homes where families are crammed together. His last name is Palcelli, probably an immigrant. The foreigners were hit the hardest, mainly because the foreigners crammed together in smaller quarters. Had nothing to do with the virus attacking one group more than the other. It had to, in fact, one thing they did correlate with statistics they've spent years and years gathering, is that the closer you lived in proximity to other people, the faster you'd die. Sometimes entire families would get perished. I did find an article, and unfortunately I couldn't find it to put it in the presentation now that I wanted it. Articles of all 6 family members gone. Whole family. Whole families would get sick. Now, this one says, there have been a number of instances where husband and wife are down too weak to attend to the children who are also ill. It's the adults, it's that 20 to 40 age group that is so sick they can't get out of bed. The kids are living through it. But there's so many stories too that if the parents couldn't get to them, the children would not die of epidemic, they would die of starvation. The death toll, what's it costing us? Public funerals are prohibited. They're limited to immediate family. Church funerals are banned. We're learning, a little too late sometimes, but we're learning that any public gathering is not a good thing. The undertakers are overwhelmed. Requests are sent to the nearby towns for assistance for undertakers, just as they were for doctors and nurses, and we get the same response. Sorry, we've got our own problems. They're working so hard, they're collapsing on the job, just like the doctors. This was written by the editor of the Bridgewater Independent. He says, next to doctors, the undertakers are the busiest people in town. Caskets are in short supply. There are in some cities, and I don't know about Brockton, but in some cities they were putting them under armed guard because they were being stolen. It was bad. In some places they just couldn't get them delivered. They didn't have enough to go around. This one actually delayed the funeral.
Do you know if the dead bodies were still considered contagious, like Ebola?
Yes. Yes, but I also read articles, not in the Brockton Enterprise, which is why they're not here. For instance, the husband would die, the wife's sick, She doesn't have the energy to push him out of bed. She crawls in with him. And that was happening, especially in cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, especially in areas that were full of tenements and packed. They didn't know what to do with the bodies.
I'm just wondering if the undertakers were going to catch it.
The undertakers were. In fact, I did find a death notice of one of the undertakers died. What they were doing, though, in some of the larger cities, especially like Philadelphia, was they were putting the bodies out on the front porch. They were putting them on the fire escape. They were putting them in a room and shutting the door because they had no place to put them and nobody to come get them. Eventually, when the epidemic, the height of it passed and they were starting to recoup, they would put them out on the front porch and they'd come by with horse-drawn wagons and they would pick up the bodies and take them. Philadelphia, they actually hired a big steam shovel and built trench to do a huge trench to do mass graves. But in a lot of instances, and it did happen in Brockton, they were putting bodies in a room and shutting the door. A lot of them, if 6 and 7 family members shared the same room, the body was put in the corner. They'd crawl into bed. There was nothing they could do. There was nobody. You couldn't get anybody to come give you a hand. One survivor later said, people would come to your door and give you casseroles and help when somebody fell ill. Not during this epidemic. Even your best friends wouldn't give you a hand. They wouldn't. Undertakers are forced to wait their turn at the livery stables for the return of the horses and hearses. They're having to line these funerals up. They're happening so much. Funerals are scheduled. They had to put them on a schedule, beginning at 6:40 a.m. and going till 5 p.m. The same editor of the Bridgewater Independent said that there is not an hour in the day when a funeral cortege will not be seen in motion. They're running sun up, sundown. It's so bad that even the horses are dying from it. A horse dropped dead of exhaustion on the side of the road.
Oh, not from the flu.
It's just exhausted. Although rumors did go around that the horse had the flu.
Yeah.
Honest to God, they did. But the horses couldn't keep up. There were so many funerals that they weren't getting the rest they needed, so the horses were dropping dead. Even the undertakers there wasn't an undertaker that wasn't busy, constantly busy during this. They were working literally till they dropped and were forced into bed by someone. But even then, they didn't have access to supplies. They were running out of everything. Not just caskets, but formaldehyde and embalming fluids, and disinfectants and germicides, everything. But finally, it starts to pass. On October 5th, they finally admit, since the peak, for the first time since the peak, it is announced yesterday that there was no influenza case without medical treatment, although the shortage of nurses still continues to be acute. Finally, on the 10th of October, they say 7 deaths and 82 new cases. But 82, and that's in the last 24 hours. But 82 is a marked improvement from hundreds of new cases a day. Brockton starts thinking about lifting their bans and letting public gatherings start going. This is October 4th. And the grip situation is clearing up so rapidly in Brockton that it is now expected that the Board of Health will allow the schools to reopen Monday. So rapidly. What they said is normally if you think of a bell curve, this thing, once it hit the zenith, it was like a cliff. It would just drop. It'd be done. It'd be over with. This thing, like I said, it started out as kindling, a little kindling fire in Haskell County, Kansas. Died out when we threw some wood on it, and then it roared into a blaze. But now it had mutated to the point that it was no longer vicious or a threat to the humans, and now it was out of fuel. Same thing in Bridgewater. The epidemic has departed almost as suddenly as it came. October 17th. In cities and towns, from the first case to the last one was well and recovered, averaged about 6 weeks. In military encampments, it was about 3 to 4 weeks because of the crowding. So about 6 weeks. In this case, we see that the first death happened on September 14th. So they'd already been ill, probably about a week by then. So we're looking at 5 weeks here before they're saying, yep, we're only getting 82 new cases. The flu probably went for another 1 or 2 weeks past that, so that would be right about the 6 week, 7 week mark. And they're very, very happy. That was the headline in the Brockton Enterprise on October 15th. And I can't say that I blame them.
How many teachers then?
I don't know. I don't have a number on that one. That's a good question. But I do know September 30th, they opened the Howard Seminary for the season. And within 3 weeks, they had a death there. Didn't take very long. But now that people are recovering, what are we dealing with? First thing is we had 9 nurses die in Brockton. We had quite a few. 2 of them were twin sisters who actually were buried together. 9 nurses isn't bad, but if you think that we had such a shortage of nurses to begin with, I mean, that's still a pretty good ratio. I mean, that's a high ratio of deaths. Food supply. They're bringing nourishment to the needy. And by needy, we don't mean people that can't afford it. We're bringing nourishment to the people who haven't been able to get out of bed, who haven't been able to go get groceries, who are still too sick to take care of themselves. And as we start going door to door, what we also see, what we're also doing at the time is we're fumigating. We're fumigating factories. And we're agreeing to let all employees take a 15-minute open air session at noon. I'm wondering if, I don't know, but I'm wondering if this is where our lunch breaks actually started, our state mandated lunch breaks. And they have to, as it says, open air. They're forcing these people, go outside, breathe. Here it says that state board's attitude on churches is unchanged. And this was October 11th. But they would open soon after that. But as we're going door to door, what we're also finding is pitiful conditions. Family of 4, all in one bed, all sick. Man and boy nearly reduced to starvation. We're also finding single people in apartments by themselves that thought that they could just go to bed and sleep through it. And they're finding that they are now so malnourished that even if they're recovering from the virus, they're too weak to get themselves out of bed. We're finding people that have died in their apartment and nobody noticed because they were immigrants and they didn't have family in the area. We're finding very bad situations. So one of the things they're begging for volunteers to come with food. They're begging for volunteers to come with clean bed sheets and linens. They're begging for volunteers to do laundry. And then because what they're finding too is now that they're taking people home from the hospitals, the homes aren't suitable for people to recover in. Surprising number of Brockton homes have left scores of homes sadly disorganized, unsanitary, and short of food needed. It took us weeks to recover from this, even after the virus left. It really was a disaster area. I mean, we think of disasters typically being hurricanes and tornadoes and things, but this was the same thing. It came in and it ripped homes and families apart and left almost as suddenly as it had come. And then wave 3 started. Wave 3 hit worldwide from late 1918, about December, to March 1919. Same virus, started all over again. Cases were reported as late as spring 1922. November 20th, in Brockton, more than 150 new influenza cases. Then you see this paper, Fluies in Brockton, November 23rd, right in time for Thanksgiving. The only good thing about this is that the severity was often opposite of wave 2. So if a town did not get hit heavy with wave 2, which was so fatal, they were now getting hit hard with wave 3. But like Brockton had gotten hit very, very hard. Wave 3 was very mild in comparison. People were not dying in wave 3. They were through the worst of it. But just when they thought, and I can assure, I would think if you've just lost your husband, you've just lost a child, and now one of your other children comes down sick in November,
Panic.
I'd panic. Probably would. I would probably panic at every cough and cold that came along for years after this. But this is what the town was dealing with, was wave 3. So as far as how this affected us worldwide, it is now thought that this virus originated in birds. That's what scientists nowadays have come along, and they've been able to go back. Actually, the doctors back then kept specimens well enough that it was just within the last decade that we've gone and we've reevaluated those specimens and checked. We've mapped the genome of the virus and figured it out. Almost all cases of human influenza today descend from this 1918 virus. They're all a mutation of it. Isn't that crazy? It still affects us today. Estimated, that's wrong. My apologies. 50 million. Or no, that's actually right. 500 million ill got sick. 500 million sick worldwide. In the US, at least 1 in 4. Most, there are some scholarly journals that place it closer at 1 to 3. But when you think of most of those are adults between the ages of 20 and 40, it's pretty nasty. If the 7-year-olds and the 50-year-olds are the ones that are the 3 that aren't sick, and you're the breadwinner of the family, you and your wife being sick would be devastating. Estimated 50 million died worldwide. 50 million. AIDS has killed 35 million in 37 years. Wow. This flu did it in 3 weeks. 50 million is more men than have died in all of the wars in the last century. All of them of combat. Some cities experienced over 10,000 deaths a week at the peak of this. Philadelphia being one of them. It lowered US life expectancy by 12 years because it killed so many so disproportionately young. This is what the mortality graph looks like. This starts at 1900. This goes to 1963. These lines down here represent measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, whooping cough, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. And you'll never guess which one there's influenza and pneumonia. And you'll never guess which year was 1918. Estimated 675,000 excess deaths in the US. What that means, excess deaths, is anybody, if we figure that people typically die of the flu every year, then we kind of take those as just normal, that's just normal cost of doing business in the, cost of life, so to speak. Excess deaths are those above and beyond what you would expect to see. That was with a population of 105 million in the United States. If we adjust that for the population today, we could expect deaths of over 2 million in the United States. That's pretty staggering. Almost half of these deaths were the 20 to 40-year-old group. In the US military alone, more men died from the Spanish influenza in 1918 than they died in Vietnam, just in the military. And we thought Vietnam was bad. 15 times more civilians died than military members. And the influenza and pneumonia, which are always grouped together because one typically leads to the other, still account for approximately 50,000 deaths every year in the US today.
Get your flu shot.
Get your flu shot.
Got it today.
So that's my presentation. I'd like to send a special thanks to Norma Callahan, who has spent countless hours with me at the Brockton Enterprise and has been reading through the newspaper articles. She's been invaluable to my research, and she's probably tired of picking up the phone and hearing me go, "Oh my God, you know what happened in 1918?" As I said, though, she and I have compiled a binder. Unfortunately, we've only printed the first half of the articles we found so far, but they are up here for anyone that's interested in perusing them. But who's got questions?